Yeah, welcome to today's edition of Meet the Researcher, brought to you by Penprick. My name is Uli Funken. I'm delighted to have Dr. Simon Stott back with us. Simon is Director of Research for Cure Parkinson. But you may also be familiar with Simon's blog called The Science of Parkinson's. Today, Simon will talk to us about recent research on nutrition and disease progression in PD. It's called Sugar and Spice and Everything Nice. Over to you, Simon.
So thank you very much, Uli, and thank you everyone for from Penprick for the invitation to come back and speak again. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. So yes, my name's Simon. I'm the Director of Research at Cure Parkinson's, and today what I'd like to do is talk to you about some new research on nutrition and Parkinson's. But I'm going to start off with a little bit of a history lesson. And it begins with this gentleman here. His name is Captain James Lancaster, and in 1601 he conducted a rather unethical experiment that had important implications for the seafaring community. In that year, in April of that year, he left the south coast of England with his 4 vessels that he had under his command, and he sailed down the west coast of Africa, arriving in South Africa in early September of that year. But the trip down there was not very easy for everybody involved, as 3 of the ships became so sick with scurvy that the men from Lancaster's own vessel, the Red Dragon, had to help sail them into harbour when they arrived in South Africa. And when I say sick, I mean really sick. 40% of the crews died. So it was a really, really bad trip for almost everybody involved. But one odd, curious fact is that nobody on Lancaster's own boat, Red Dragon, got sick with scurvy. And the obvious question is, how was this possible? And the answer to the question is that every morning of the journey down, the crew of the Red Dragon were given 3 spoonfuls of lemon juice. And lemon juice has got lots of good stuff in it, but one important ingredient was vitamin C, or ascorbic acid, which is now known to treat scurvy. And upon returning to England, Lancaster was very quick in giving a full report of the experiment to the Admiralty, but it was another 200 years before the Admiralty actually decided to mandate lemon juice for all of its sailors. So not an immediate take-up of the newly discovered knowledge there. But it's a great example of what can be referred to as food as medicine. And throughout history, there have been lots and lots of examples of this. But one unfortunate fact about food and nutrition in terms of Parkinson's research is that there's so little of it. This is a graph I like to show, demonstrating to everybody the amount of research that's been done on Parkinson's. If you go to the PubMed search engine and type in the word Parkinson's, you'll see that there over the last 200 years, the vast majority of the research has been done in the last 15 to 20 years. These bars down here represent the number of reports each year. So last year we went almost to 12,000. And this year we'll be going well over 12,000. But overall, there's been about 155,000 research reports with the keyword Parkinson's, 80% of them since the year 2000. But unfortunately, only just over 3,000 have had the keyword food. 2,000 have had the keyword nutrition. Less than 1,500 have had the keyword diet. And also, I was just throwing in here exercise as well. Only 4,000 have had the keyword exercise. So these are very easily modifiable aspects of life for people with Parkinson's that are being under-researched. And it's probably an area, these probably a couple of areas that we need to change. But before we really dig into food and nutrition and diet, it's important to establish exactly what we mean. What's the difference between nutrition and diet? So diet refers to the actual amount of, or the form of food that's being consumed by an individual. So think of diet as the quantity of food. Whereas nutrition involves the process of utilizing the food for metabolism and repair and growth of tissues. So what's important there is the quality of the food. When you talk about diet, we're talking about the amount of food. And when we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about the quality of food. And in nutrition, you can break it down even further, looking at macronutrients such as fats and carbohydrates and proteins. And then you've got micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals, which are essential for our daily functioning. And then you've also got things like fiber and accessory nutrients like flavonoids, and we can come back to flavonoids in a moment. And then we're also supporting microorganisms in our body with things like prebiotics. And an example of why these things are important, which is often overlooked in Parkinson's, is vitamin B6. So vitamin B6 is an essential vitamin when we think about converting L-DOPA to dopamine. It's a key part of the enzymatic function or enzymatic reaction that's involved. So when you turn L-DOPA to dopamine, you need vitamin B6. And vitamin B6 is a well-recognized complication when it comes to L-DOPA carbidopa therapy. People take L-DOPA carbidopa therapy, and their vitamin B6 levels crash because the vitamin B6 is being utilized in that reaction of turning the L-DOPA into dopamine in the brain. And so what we often see is that people with Parkinson's have a deficiency in vitamin B6. And high vitamin B6 intake has been associated with a significantly reduced risk of developing Parkinson's, and also with better outcomes when Parkinson's has already been diagnosed. So this is one tiny aspect of our diet and our nutrition in terms of Parkinson's that is well known and can be dealt with. But as I said, I was going to share with you some new research that's been recently published in terms of nutrition and diet. And the thing I'm going to start off with is sugar. So recently, some researchers in Australia, led by Professor Caroline Sue, have found that people with Parkinson's eat significantly more sugar than people without Parkinson's in terms of their energy intake. When they looked at carbohydrate intake, there wasn't much of a difference. It was higher, but it wasn't significant. But then when they looked at actual daily sugar intake, it was significantly different. As you can see on the bottom here, it's 153 grams per day for people with Parkinson's versus less than 120 grams for people without Parkinson's. So people with Parkinson's were taking in a lot more sugar than people without. If this could be, it could be involved as a sort of compensatory mechanism for the low level of dopamine, was one of the sort of speculations. But as you can see here, this graph sort of really demonstrates the control group are in blue, and they get on average about 7% of their energy intakes coming from free sugar. But with the green bars, which is the people with Parkinson's, you can see it's shifting over towards higher and higher percentages. And it's probably more around the 10% mark that where people are getting, people with Parkinson's are getting their sugar intake from about 10% free sugars. And it's important because these higher levels of sugar intake were associated with experiencing chronic pain, with cognitive decline, with depression. But curiously, with depressed PD patients, consumption of alcohol was less than non-depressed. So that was kind of counterintuitive. But also high levels of sugar were associated with reports of impulse control disorder as well. And a lot of non-motor symptoms were associated with higher sugar consumption, such as poor quality of life and increased constipation severity. As well, the folks who were taking higher levels of sugar also had greater daily L-DOPA requirements. Why would this be? Why would it be more of a negative outcome from taking high levels of sugar? Well, one biological process that's associated with high levels of sugar is a process called glycation. This is a non-enzymatic, or it's basically a random biological reaction in the body where sugar is binding to proteins willy-nilly, just randomly, but by doing so, it's affecting their conformation and their function. So the proteins aren't able to do exactly what they're supposed to do. And this can have longer term consequences as glycation builds up. And glycation's been associated with aging and various other conditions. So lowering our levels of sugar intake is actually a highly recommended step forward. But the problem is that sugar is in everything, basically, from tomato sauce through to doorknobs. Everything's got sugar in it, it seems. It's a problem for the modern world. But there are ways of reducing those sugar cravings. One way is to get more sleep. Another way is to actually find support, get friends and family involved with stopping us from taking in too much sugar. Then there's also compensating the free sugars or the processed sugars with more fruit or more healthy carbohydrates. And that's where I'm going to nicely segue into another area of research, Parkinson's, that's recently produced very interesting results, and that's in terms of flavonoids. So flavonoids are a group of natural substances that occur in a lot of the fruit that we eat, and the vegetables and grains, etc. They're well known to have health benefits in terms of diet and well-being. There's also lots of different types of flavonoids. As you can see, they occur in all sorts of different fruits and vegetables. But very recently, a group of researchers have demonstrated that intake of flavonoids and flavonoid-rich foods was associated with a significantly lower risk of mortality. So in the time frame that they were looking at a cohort of people with Parkinson's, the people with higher intake of flavonoids, so eating more of these fruits and vegetables, they had a lower risk of actually dying during that time frame. So the suggestion is that they were healthier and that their progression of Parkinson's was slower. But it's not the same research group have previously demonstrated that flavonoids also reduce the risk of actually developing Parkinson's in men, not women, strangely. So increasing our diet, our intake of flavonoids in our diet is also a simple step that can be made going forward. Spice is part of the title of this talk, Sugar and Spice and All Things Nice. So recently there's been a clinical trial that I thought was very interesting. Curcumin has long been recognized in the medicinal communities as having benefits across various conditions. And it's recently been investigated in a clinical trial in Parkinson's, where they looked at both clinical and skin biopsy outcomes. So for 12 months, people were taking curcumin. There were 19 people that volunteered to take the curcumin, and there were 14 who said they weren't prepared to take curcumin, but they would be part of the trial. And so one important detail here is that it wasn't blinded from the standpoint of the folks taking the actual treatments. They knew that they were taking the curcumin or the placebo, but the clinical assessments were blind. The clinicians doing the assessments had no idea who was who or what they were taking. But what they found was that the individuals taking the supplement of curcumin daily had slower rates of progression in terms of Parkinson's. You see that here in the UPDRS off score and the Cohen and Yahr scores. They were 5 for the UPDRS versus 11 in the untreated. and 0.2 versus 0.7 in the Hone and Yar. But also there were improvements in the cognitive scores as well. The reduction suggests improvement, whereas an increase suggests decline. And these were significant scores, as you can see. And also, one important detail in the study was that if you were part of the curcumin treated group, you weren't allowed to increase your L-DOPA levels, the dosing of your L-DOPA over the 12-month period. So while the supplemented group had benefits and no increase of their L-DOPA, the untreated group showed signs of decline and increased their L-DOPA level, their daily L-DOPA levels. So that in itself was quite interesting. But then when they also looked at the skin biopsies, they looked at this protein called alpha-synuclein. It sounds like a distant galaxy in some faraway part of our universe, but it's actually one of the most common proteins in our brains, and it's associated with Parkinson's because it aggregates, it sticks together in some of the cells in PD. And when they looked at skin biopsies, they found that the curcumin group, which is in the red here, the treated group, the baseline is in the blue and the red is the 12-month measure. So they had a biopsy taken at baseline, they had a biopsy taken at 12 months. And you can see it's not statistically significant, but there is a trend towards lower levels of alpha-synuclein in skin biopsy. Whereas the untreated group, they started out with a lower level of alpha-synuclein in their skin biopsy in the blue bar, but then it increased over the 12-month period. So this is, while there could be a placebo effect occurring in the clinical scores, I'm not sure how you can have a placebo response when it comes to biopsies. So these were positive trends that I thought made this study quite interesting. So that was curcumin. And then finally, I'm just going to talk very quickly about vitamins. And this one doesn't necessarily relate immediately to Parkinson's, but as you'll see, it could potentially have implications. So very recently, a phase 3 clinical trial, which is the final step in the clinical trial process, was published. And this is for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. This is motor neurons disease, which is a much more progressive and rapid condition compared to Parkinson's. In this condition, the researchers gave very high doses of methylcarbamate, finally got it out, which is a form of vitamin B12. And they had 129 people involved in the study. Half of them were given the high-dose vitamin B12, and half were given placebo. And the study was conducted in Japan, and it was a 16-week-long study. And as you can see, while both of the groups started at the same level in terms of their total clinical rating score, and almost immediately, the high-dose vitamin B12 group were progressing at a slower rate compared to the placebo-treated group, which is in the orange here. So this is a very positive result for the ALS community. And as a result, SI, the pharmaceutical company involved, has announced that they're going to go to the regulators and try and get the treatment approved based on these results for ALS. But as I said, this could have implications for Parkinson's, because a lot of the longitudinal studies that have looked at Parkinson's and lifestyle factors contributing to things like cognitive outcomes have observed that high levels of vitamin B12 are associated with better cognitive outcomes in Parkinson's. So if you're diagnosed with low levels, and typically people with Parkinson's have lower levels of vitamin B12, and if those levels stay low, your outcome is going to be significantly worse than if you start with high levels of vitamin B12 and maintain those high levels of vitamin B12. And there have been studies that have shown if you start with low levels of vitamin B12 and you increase your vitamin B12 during that observational period, that you have better outcomes compared to those who started low and remained low. So again, this is just an example of how some of the vitamins can be having an influence in terms of Parkinson's progression. Before I finish, I just wanted to quickly talk about diet in general, and that's where I'm going to introduce this person here. This is Dr. Laurie Mischely, and she's done a lot of research on Parkinson's and diet and nutritional supplements in terms of Parkinson's progression. And she's published this paper here a couple of years ago, where she took 58 people with Parkinson's and asked them to complete a questionnaire about various modifiable variables in diet and nutrition that could be influencing Parkinson's progression. And what she found, and it was very strong findings, was that slow Parkinson's progression was associated with fresh fruit and vegetables, also nut and seeds and fish and olive oil, wine, surprisingly, but also the use of spices and herbs, etc. And then fast progression was associated with basically anything in a can, be it vegetable or fruit, and with soda, water, carbonated drinks, but also fried food and beef, red meat. And she now has a new study ongoing at the moment, which is called the Modifiable Variables in Parkinsonism, or MVP. And where they're again looking at dietary and lifestyle factors that could be associated with slower progression in Parkinson's. And if anybody wants to have a look at some of the information on all of these various slides that are presented today, please just reach out and let me know. I'm happy to send these slides on. So just quickly summarizing, obviously diet and nutrition are important, but significantly under-researched in terms of Parkinson's. People with Parkinson's have a higher intake of sugar, and that can have very negative impact on outcomes. High flavonoid intake is associated with better outcomes in the form of lower risk of all types of mortality. And a recent clinical trial indicated beneficial effects from the spice curcumin, and high levels of vitamin B12 appear to be disease modifying for ALS, but are recognized as having beneficial effects in Parkinson's. And just trying to maintain a healthy diet is obviously going to have benefits. So just avoid, basically, as I said, anything in a can. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
How do we cure the gap between clinicians, research scientists, and the suspicions of people with Parkinson's that diet and exercise does make a difference? We sometimes feel like your poor old admiral trying to get 4 ships into the harbour when nobody's listening and nobody is trained to listen.
Yeah, a lot of folks, when they get diagnosed with Parkinson's, are told by the clinician to see a dietitian and eat healthy, et cetera, but there isn't really any follow-up, and in a lot of those cases. And in terms of the research, it's just really surprising that it's so under investigated, because it is a modifiable variable in the daily lives of everybody involved. So yeah, it's a bit of a mystery to me, but we do need to do something.
Is it because there's no money in the research or for the research?
I didn't want to say that, because that just makes it sound like everything involves profits at the end of the day. But it's very, very likely. If there is no intellectual property opportunity in a clinical trial, it's going to have a hard time potentially being funded. But that's just, unfortunately, the sad nature of the world that we live in.
Okay, thank you.
Can I put a couple of questions together, because they may need to be together for an answer. You've identified in your talk, and also in your the blog on sugar, a couple of different situations where the gender has a significant influence, and that puzzles me. Together with the processing of vitamins, B12, B6, all of those that you've nominated, are there genetic predispositions to better processing of vitamins that would be important, or do we speak of gene faults for not processing vitamins?
Okay, there's two questions there, one regarding gender and the other one regarding genetics. On the gender side, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but yes, women and men are rather different. Women being the better and the stronger of the sexes. But biologically, there are significant differences, and we're now taking these into account when we look at molecules in the linked clinical trials program. Could this be better in females versus males? Because at the moment, we just sort of throw everybody into a clinical trial and hope that we see an effect. But it could be that it's only having an effect in women versus men or men versus women. So it's an important variable, and it's being more and more recognized in preclinical data as well. A lot of studies have involved, for example, male mice versus female mice, and the different research groups are seeing different results as a result of gender. In terms of genetics and the vitamins and nutrient processing, etc., yes, it certainly does have an important impact. But our understanding of those genetics is still probably pretty primitive. We're looking at genetic defects on an individual basis, whereas what we have individually is just hundreds, if not thousands, of genetic variations in our DNA that can influence these things in different ways. And it's working out that balancing act is going to have to be done on an individual basis. But there are certainly genetic risk factors. There's certainly genetic variables that are influencing these things, yes.
So the genetic issue is really a big data issue, yeah?
Yes, yeah. On an individual level, basically, yes.
Can I put in a plea for pre and post-menopausal women? So
Yes.
We're very different.
Yes.
Just a simple question, really. Is if the body is lacking in any one of the vitamins or sort of spices, etc., the things you just identified, is there a benefit in taking initial high doses, or does the body just regulate itself, and is this a long-term benefit rather than an initial sort of shock treatment?
So yeah, one important caveat I should have added to the talk that I didn't, and I realize it now, is that all of this research information should be taken with a grain of salt, excuse the pun, and any sort of changes to your treatment regime should be done with consultation with your clinician, because if you suddenly decide to take bucket loads of vitamin B12 or vitamin B6, vitamin B6 in particular could have significant impact on your L-DOPA treatment, for example. But you should be doing this in consultation with doctors or your GP or your neurologist. With things like vitamin B12, I'm not sure that we've ever found a toxic level, but to just randomly start at a very high dose would probably be reckless, and you'd want to sort of titrate gradually upwards, as opposed to just diving into the deep end. But yeah, the important component here is to actually do it with your GP or your clinician, because each of us has personal medical histories, and there could be variables in that medical history that could be a reason for not doing something as opposed to doing something.
Okay, thank you.
I have one final question from me, which is not specific to this topic, much more general. Time to publish. I'm struck by the time it takes to get a paper published, whether it's peer reviewed or not. Is that a situation that is improving, or is it getting worse in your view over the last 2, 3, 4 years?
There are aspects of it that are improving. For example, there are now preprint databases. So if you've done a study, you've written up a manuscript, you want to send it to the publisher to get it published and peer reviewed and published, you can now put it onto a preprint database, which lets the science community see the results of your work before they've been peer reviewed, but with the understanding that they have not been peer reviewed. Mm-hmm. So this is dissemination of new science and new data, and that's sped things up significantly. But one of the issues with the peer review process is that researchers are very busy doing the research, and they're asked by the publishing houses to peer review papers for free, and this takes time out of their day, which they're volunteering themselves, and finding that free time can take time. So you have situations where the peer review process can take weeks, if not months. But one aspect of the peer review process that the general public don't see or appreciate is that it is a good process. Every paper that I've been involved with that's gone through that peer review process has been improved by going through that peer review process. Mm-hmm. I'm not just talking about grammatical corrections, but suggestions, constructive suggestions coming back from the peer reviewers saying, have you considered this? Why don't you do this experiment just to be absolutely sure that you're right about this detail? And it's always strengthened the end result. So while the dissemination of the information quicker and faster is great, cleaning up that data and being absolutely sure about the data is key as well. There are no shortcuts. Mm-hmm. is what I'm getting at, I think. Mm-hmm. And as long as it is a constructive process, I think peer review is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Right. If there's no more questions, I'd like to bring the talk to an end. We're aiming to have a separate Q&A session, if that was desired, in October, to allow people to digest the information that Simon's just given us and come back together. So watch this space. I'd like to thank you, Simon, for talking to us again, and thanks to the PenPrick team for organizing the session. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.